Full text of the Constitutional Court's ruling. We will now begin the ruling on Case 2024-8 concerning the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. First, we will examine the procedural requirements for this case. 1. Whether the declaration of martial law in this case is subject to judicial review. Given that the purpose of impeachment is to protect constitutional order from violations committed by high-ranking public officials, even if the declaration of martial law may be seen as a highly political decision, it is still subject to review concerning potential violations of the Constitution and laws. 2. Whether the impeachment bill is invalid due to the lack of investigation by the Legislation and Judiciary Committee of the National Assembly. The Constitution delegates the procedure for impeachment to legislative law, and the National Assembly Act grants discretion to the Assembly on whether such investigation is necessary. Therefore, the absence of an investigation by the Judiciary Committee does not render the impeachment resolution procedurally invalid. 3. Whether the passage of the impeachment motion violates the principle of single deliberation ilsabujai. The National Assembly Act prohibits the resubmission of a rejected bill during the same session, although the first impeachment motion against the respondent failed to reach a vote during the 418th regular session. The current motion was submitted during the 419th extraordinary session. Therefore, it does not violate the principle of single deliberation. Justice Jong Hyung-sik added a supplementary opinion, stating that legislation is needed to limit the number of times an impeachment motion may be submitted even across different sessions. 4. Whether there was a lack of protected legal interests, given that martial law was lifted shortly after its declaration and caused no actual damage. Even though the declaration of martial law was lifted within a short period, the impeachment cause had already been established by the act of declaring martial law itself. Therefore, the adjudicative interest is not denied simply because the order was later revoked. 5. Whether it is problematic that the original impeachment motion cited criminal offenses such as rebellion, but was later reframed as a violation of the Constitution. We will now examine the respondent's actions based on constitutional violations, regardless of how they were initially presented in the impeachment resolution. Changing or withdrawing the applicable legal provisions, while maintaining the same essential facts, does not constitute a withdrawal or alteration of the impeachment grounds. Therefore, such changes are permitted without undergoing any special procedures. The respondent also claims that, without the portion of the impeachment motion citing rebellion under criminal law, the motion would not have met the required quorum. However, this is purely hypothetical and lacks any objective evidence to support it. 6. Concerning the allegation that the impeachment power was abused to forcibly remove the president from office. The process of passing the impeachment motion was lawful, and the respondent's violations of the Constitution or law were sufficiently substantiated. Thus, the use of the impeachment power in this case cannot be deemed abusive. Accordingly, the petition for impeachment adjudication is legally valid. Regarding evidentiary rules, Justice Lee Mi-seon and Justice Kim Hyung-do expressed supplementary opinions that the strict rules of hearsay evidence under the Criminal Procedure Act may be relaxed in impeachment proceedings. On the other hand, Justices Kim Bok-hyung and Cho Han-chang offered supplementary opinions, suggesting that more rigorous application of evidentiary rules should be considered in future impeachment trials. Next, we will examine whether the respondent violated the Constitution or laws in the performance of official duties, and whether such violations were serious enough to justify removal from office. First, we will consider each allegation individually. 1. Regarding the declaration of martial law in this case. According to the Constitution and the Martial Law Act, one of the substantive requirements for declaring a state of emergency martial law is the actual occurrence of a situation such as a war, armed conflict, or a comparable national emergency in which the state is engaged in hostilities or public order, has been so severely disrupted that the functioning of administrative and judicial institutions becomes significantly impaired. The respondent claimed that such an extreme crisis situation had arisen due to the opposition party, which held a parliamentary majority, attempting to abuse its legislative authority by unilaterally pushing for impeachment, passing laws, and cutting budgets. Since the respondent's inauguration, and prior to the declaration of martial law, the National Assembly had submitted a total of 22 impeachment motions against the Minister of Interior and Safety, prosecutors, the chairman of the Broadcasting Commission, the Auditor General, and others. This led to concerns that the impeachment system was being used not as a legal remedy for constitutional violations, but rather as a political tool to pressure the executive branch based merely on suspicions of wrongdoing without proper legal examination. However, at the time the respondent declared martial law, only 2 impeachment proceedings were ongoing, one against a prosecutor and one against the chairman of the Korea Communications Commission. The respondent argued that certain legislative bills passed unilaterally by the opposition party were problematic. However, those bills had not yet taken legal effect, as the respondent had either requested reconsideration or withheld their promulgation. Regarding the 2025 budget bill, it had no impact on the situation at the time of the declaration of martial law, as the 2024 budget was still in effect and the budget proposal had only been approved by the Special Committee on Budget and Accounts, but not yet passed in the plenary session. Therefore, it cannot be said that the National Assembly's exercise of its powers, including impeachment, legislation, and budget review, created a real and substantial crisis situation at the time martial law was declared. Even if the National Assembly's actions were unlawful or improper, such matters could be addressed through regular constitutional procedures, including the Constitutional Court's rulings on impeachment, or the President's own authority to request reconsideration of bills. Thus, invoking emergency powers was not justified. The respondent also argued that the declaration of martial law was intended to address suspicions of election fraud. However, the mere existence of suspicions cannot be deemed to constitute a real and substantial crisis. The National Election Commission, NEC, had announced that it had addressed most of the security vulnerabilities prior to the 22nd general elections. Additionally, the NEC implemented countermeasures such as 24-hour public access to CCTV footage of mail-in ballot storage sites, and a parallel manual ballot counting system during the vote tallying process. In light of these measures, the respondents' claims lack persuasive grounds. Ultimately, even when taking all of the respondents' assertions into account, it cannot be objectively concluded that a grave crisis situation existed at the time martial law was declared, one that would justify such a decision. The Constitution and the Martial Law Act require that, in order to declare emergency martial law, there must be a clear military necessity or a public safety need that justifies the mobilization of armed forces. However, the legislative gridlock or suspicions of election fraud cited by the respondent are political, institutional, and judicial issues that must be resolved through democratic means, not by the use of military force. The respondent claimed that the declaration of martial law in this case was intended as a warning type or appeal type measure to inform the public of the opposition party's abuse of power and the national crisis. However, such a purpose is not recognized under the Martial Law Act. Moreover, the respondent went beyond a mere declaration, mobilizing military and police forces to obstruct the National Assembly's exercise of power. Such actions constitute violations of the Constitution and the law. Therefore, the respondent's argument is unacceptable. Accordingly, the declaration of martial law in this case violated the substantive legal requirements for declaring emergency martial law. Next, we examine whether the declaration followed the proper procedures. Under the law, the declaration of martial law and the appointment of the martial law commander must be reviewed by the State Council Cabinet. While it is acknowledged that the respondent briefly explained the purpose of the declaration to the Prime Minister and 9 other cabinet members prior to issuing the order, the respondent failed to explain the specific details such as the appointment of the martial law commander and did not give the other members a chance to express their opinions. Therefore, it is difficult to conclude that proper deliberation took place regarding the declaration of martial law. Furthermore, the respondent declared martial law, even though the Prime Minister and related cabinet members did not countersign the emergency martial law proclamation. In addition, the respondent failed to publicly announce the effective time, the designated area, and the appointment of the martial law commander. The respondent also did not promptly notify the National Assembly, thus violating the procedural requirements stipulated in the Constitution and the Martial Law Act. Regarding the deployment of military and police forces to the National Assembly, the respondent instructed the Minister of National Defense to deploy military forces into the National Assembly. In response, soldiers entered the parliamentary compound, using helicopters and other means, with some troops even breaking windows and entering the main building. The respondent also personally made 6 phone calls to commanders, including the commander of the Army Special Warfare Command, telling them, "It appears the quorum has not been met. Break the door if necessary, get inside, and inform everyone of the contents of the martial law proclamation." Following this, the chief of the National Police Agency ordered the police to block all entrances to the National Assembly. As a result, some lawmakers who had been gathering at the Assembly were forced to climb over fences, while others could not enter the building at all. Meanwhile, the Minister of National Defense instructed the Director of the Defense Counterintelligence Command to identify the locations of 14 individuals, including the Speaker of the National Assembly and leaders of various political parties, with the stated purpose of arrest if necessary. The respondent personally called the First Deputy Director of the National Intelligence Service (NIS), ordering support for the Defense Counterintelligence Command. Subsequently, the director of that unit requested location tracking of those individuals from the NIS. In this manner, the respondent not only deployed military and police forces to block access to the National Assembly and remove legislators from the premises, but also actively interfered with the legislature's exercise of its constitutional powers. These actions violated the constitutional provision that grants the National Assembly the authority to request the lifting of martial law. Furthermore, they infringed upon lawmakers' right to deliberate and vote, as well as their privilege of immunity from arrest. By attempting to locate the leaders of political parties, the respondent also violated the constitutional guarantee of political party activities by using military force to obstruct the constitutional powers of the legislature for political purposes. The respondent placed honorable soldiers whose duty is to safeguard national security and defend the nation in direct confrontation with civilian lawmakers. In doing so, the respondent violated the principle of political neutrality of the military, as well as the constitutional duty to exercise supreme command over the armed forces, in accordance with the Constitution. Regarding the proclamation order issued in this case, through the proclamation order, the respondent prohibited the activities of the National Assembly, local councils, and political parties. In doing so, the respondent violated multiple constitutional principles, including the provision granting the National Assembly the right to request the lifting of martial law, the clause protecting political party systems, the foundations of representative democracy, and the principle of separation of powers. The respondent also infringed upon citizens' fundamental political rights freedom of assembly and association, and freedom of occupation by violating constitutional and statutory provisions that strictly limit the restriction of civil liberties under emergency martial law, as well as the constitutional principle of warrant requirement. Regarding the search and seizure conducted at the National Election Commission (NEC), the respondent instructed the Minister of National Defense to deploy military personnel to inspect the NEC's computer systems. Military forces entered the NEC building, restricted access to the premises, confiscated mobile phones from on-duty staff, and photographed the internal computer systems. These actions constituted a warrantless search and seizure in violation of the constitutional principle of due process and judicial oversight. They also undermined the institutional independence of the National Election Commission (NEC) regarding the attempt to track the whereabouts of legal professionals. As previously mentioned, the respondent participated in attempts to identify the locations of individuals with the intention of detaining them if necessary. Among the targets were the former Chief Justice and recently retired justices of the Supreme Court. Such actions created the impression that current judges could become subjects of arrest by the executive branch at any time, which constitutes an infringement of the independence of the judiciary. Final judgment on whether these actions warrant removal from office. The respondent declared martial law in an effort to overcome political conflict with the National Assembly. He then deployed military and police forces to obstruct the Assembly's constitutional functions, thereby denying the principles of popular sovereignty and democracy. He also ordered the military to conduct a warrantless raid on the National Election Commission, ignoring the constitutional structure of governance. Furthermore, by issuing the proclamation order, the respondent broadly infringed upon citizens' fundamental rights. These actions collectively violated the fundamental principles of a democratic and lawful state, directly undermined the constitutional order, and caused serious harm to the stability of the democratic republic. Although the National Assembly was able to promptly pass a resolution requesting the lifting of martial law, this was made possible only due to public resistance and the restrained conduct of the military and police. Therefore, it does not mitigate the seriousness of the respondent's constitutional violations. Presidential authority is granted solely by the Constitution. The respondent exercised the state's emergency powers, which must be used with the utmost caution, in a manner that exceeded constitutional limits, thereby eroding public trust in the presidential office. Since the respondent's inauguration, the National Assembly, dominated by the opposition, submitted an unusually high number of impeachment motions, resulting in multiple high-ranking officials having their authority suspended during ongoing adjudication. In a historic first, the 2025 national budget was passed by the Special Committee on Budget and Accounts through a reduction-only vote without any budget increases and solely by the opposition party. Key policy initiatives proposed by the respondent were repeatedly blocked by the opposition, and laws opposed by the administration were passed unilaterally by the opposition-led assembly, prompting repeated presidential objections and assembly reapprovals. In this context, it is understandable that the respondent may have felt a deep sense of responsibility, perceiving the situation as one in which government functions were paralyzed and national interests seriously undermined due to opposition overreach. The respondents' view that the National Assembly's exercise of its powers amounted to abuse of authority or caused governmental paralysis may be respected as a political opinion. However, the conflict between the president and the legislature cannot be attributed solely to one side. Such political disputes must be resolved through democratic processes, and any political expressions or official decisions must remain within the bounds of democracy, as guaranteed by the Constitution. Even if the respondent perceived the majority party's actions as tyranny, He should have relied on the constitutional mechanisms of checks and balances to preserve the democratic framework. Likewise, the National Assembly, while upholding the voice of the minority, should have exercised restraint and pursued compromise through dialogue with the government. The respondent, in turn, should have regarded the National Assembly as a legitimate counterpart representing the people. However, instead, he treated the legislature as a body to be excluded, a stance fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance. Approximately 2 years after taking office, the respondent had the opportunity to seek public support in the National Assembly elections and persuade the electorate to endorse his leadership. Even if the election results did not align with his expectations, he should not have attempted to override or nullify the will of the people who supported the opposition. Despite all of this, the respondent violated the Constitution and relevant laws by declaring martial law, thereby reviving the painful history of abusing emergency powers. This act shocked the nation and caused widespread confusion across the social, economic, political, and diplomatic spheres. As the president of all citizens, the respondent had a duty to unite the community beyond his political supporters. However, he failed in this responsibility by deploying military and police forces to undermine the authority of constitutional institutions, such as the National Assembly, and by infringing upon the fundamental rights of the people. The respondent betrayed his constitutional duty to uphold and defend the Constitution, as well as the trust of the Korean people, who are the sovereign power in a democratic republic. In the end, the respondent's unconstitutional and unlawful actions represent a grave betrayal of public trust and constitute serious violations that cannot be tolerated under the constitutional order. Given the serious harm and impact caused to the constitutional order, the benefit of safeguarding the Constitution through removal from office clearly outweighs the national cost of dismissing a sitting president. Therefore, with the unanimous agreement of all justices, the court hereby issues the following ruling. As this is an impeachment case, we will now confirm the time of the ruling. The current time is 11:22 a.m. Ruling. The respondent, President Yoon Suk-yeol, is hereby removed from office. This concludes the Constitutional Court's decision.